Hey, my name is Dan Kohler. I'm the lead pastor here, and if we haven't gotten a chance to meet yet, it's wonderful to have you with us. I'm excited for the season that we're talking about God's justice. Now, whether you've grown up in the church or maybe today is your first time really exploring anything about faith and it took a lot of boldness for you to be here, I think there's something in this morning for you. We're only going to be here for about another 45 minutes. It sounds like a lot more when I say it out loud. In my head, that sounded like a short period of time. But we're only going to be here for about another 45 minutes. And so I just want to invite you, wherever you are today, just to kind of to dial in and see maybe what could be yours today. A few months ago, we had a game time with some friends. And the game was relatively simple. Everybody kind of takes a turn reading a prompt from a box of cards. You read the prompt, and then everybody in the circle has to answer it from that person's point of view. Then everybody turns in their answers, the person reads them out loud, and then everybody has to guess which one was the person's, okay? And it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of laughter to be had, but I remember one particular prompt was what would be written on your headstone, okay? Now, there were a lot of like nice, gentle answers, like loving father, caring husband, right? My favorite one, personally, was just the person's name. Like that's it. What do you get on your headstone? Your name. That's it. People will know where you are. That is it. Games like that, I think, especially that particular prompt, I've heard in a few different contexts, and it can be funny. Like, it can be a lot of fun, but it can also be a little bit intense and meaningful. Like if you actually started thinking about that, what would be said about me after I pass? It's a really good question to think of. It can be very humbling. I remember one time I had to answer that question on behalf of this church. Now, it's one thing to think about that kind of stuff individually. It's another thing to think about that organizationally. Like whether you're thinking like I am about church or you're just thinking organizationally, whatever business you're a part of, whatever group you're a part of, if you were to think that question for that business or that group, like what would the response be? Now, I've actually heard this answer many times from people who now, some of you sitting in the chairs after conversations, but I've definitely heard it out talking with people about this church. And we'll get into conversation. I'll be talking about the church, telling them a little bit about it. It's the Alliance on 36th Ave. And one of the most common responses I get is, do you mean the white church? No, ours is kind of like a faded blue roof and a gray exterior. You're thinking the LDS church down the road. Oh, there's another church? I didn't even know you guys were there. And actually, that's kind of the common answer I've gotten even out of some of you is, we started coming here. We didn't even know there was a church out there. We're just tucked back in here in the neighborhood. Now, that's okay, because to be honest, I don't have any aspirations of being the biggest, most significant church. Like, this isn't a competition. Right? I don't have aspirations or desires to be like the most shiny or the most well-known or any of that. But I don't want us to be insignificant either. Right? Like we should matter to somebody and not just to the people that are here. Like sometimes I get thinking like, what do even our immediate neighbors think about? If we were to disappear tomorrow, what would be on this church's headstone if our neighbors had to write it? Well, they had a lot of kids running around, caused extra traffic in the road. Other than that, we didn't really know anything about them. Like I don't fear a lot, but I do fear insignificance. But I want it to be for the right reasons. I want it to matter. And here's what I believe. All of us, at some level, we don't want to be insignificant. We don't want to be irrelevant. We want something to matter. Now, as we're talking about this theme of justice, as we're talking about God being a God of justice, He is a just God, what does that mean for our church? What does that mean for this organization, where we are in this space and time? Well, we're going to find some answers in the letter to the Philippian church. So if you have a Bible, you can open it and follow along. If not, we're going to be following along on the screen as well. The scripture is going to be up there, and you can just read that. You can pull out your phone, download the Bible app, and follow along there. But we're going to be in the letter to the Philippian church, and we're going to be reading verses 14 through 18. Now, before we dive in, this gives you a little time to get there. Before we dive in, we just want to clear up some things about what this is. So this is a letter written by a guy named Paul, and Paul's story is remarkable. If you've never heard of Paul, that's okay. Paul didn't always go by the name Paul. He once went by the name Saul, and he is now, as Paul, a follower of Jesus, but he also wasn't always a follower of Jesus. At one time, he actually tracked down and tried to imprison people who followed Jesus. He was the enemy of the church. In fact, one of the most zealous, one of the most passionate enemies of the church. At some point in his story, he meets Jesus, and Jesus puts him on mission and makes him passionate about himself. Saul becomes Paul, and now Paul is one of the most passionate church leaders in the early church. Over Paul's lifetime, he hit a number of roadblocks, to kind of put it mildly. He was, multiple times, they tried to kill him. He was imprisoned, he was beaten. And even now, as we intersect this letter, Paul is writing to a church, a very young, a very new church in the city of Philippi. But Paul's writing the letter because he's in prison himself. He's sitting in prison because of Jesus, because he was preaching the message of Jesus. He was sharing the good news of who Jesus is and who he claimed to be and everything that he's done. So Paul sees what's going on. He hears about what's going on in the city of Philippi. The same things that have happened to Paul are now starting to happen to those who follow Jesus in this city. Paul wants to encourage them. He helped them get their start. He feels a sense of responsibility for them. And so now he wants to write back to them and encourage them. He wants to remind them of a few things. And that's where we're diving in here. We'll pick up in verse 14. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Now, there's some confusing things in here. If you're confused when you read the Bible, so is everybody who believes in Jesus. Like, there's a confusing thing about the Bible. It can be hard to understand sometimes. It's a person writing a long time ago to other people that were alive at the time, and now we're picking up on the writings and we're trying to understand what's going on. So we read, first, Paul writes to them, do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Now, Paul's not just criticizing their grumbling or complaining. It might be helpful for us to understand, what are they grumbling and complaining? What does that mean? Why does Paul have to say that? Because just as Paul has experienced persecution for what he believes, the church in Philippi, the believers in Philippi, they're starting to experience that same kind of adversity. People are being mean to them. They're making threats against them. They're making life very, very difficult, mistreating the followers of Jesus because they confess Jesus as their leader. Now, something's going on internally. When all of that happens, if you and I were to experience that, which we don't experience that much here in America, but if we were to experience that, we would have a couple of options for our reaction. The first one is to keep on with what we're doing. Don't let it sway us. Don't let it change what we know we need to do. The other one is start to panic a little bit. And that's what the church in Philippi was doing. They were starting to panic a little bit. They were seeing what was going on in the life of Paul. They were seeing what was happening around them, and they're thinking, oh no, what if what happened to Paul starts happening to us? And then they start looking internally. They start looking at each other. Those who are brothers and sisters in the church, those who are also following Jesus, and they start fault-finding in each other. They start criticizing and complaining against one another. And the problem is they lose all sense of what they're supposed to be about. You see, just like any organization in the world, the church has a purpose. And when adversity comes, it can make you lose track of your purpose. And Paul writes back and he says, listen, your purpose isn't to grumble and complain against each other. It's not just grumbling and complaining that's bad. It's turning inward and being self-focused and starting to fault find with one another. That's the problem that Paul points out. And the problem is, the result is that they won't be blameless and pure. You see, Paul is not just criticizing them for grumbling and complaining. Paul is pointing to a greater reality, not just in the church of Philippi, but what's going on in the community around them. In the midst of the persecution, Paul is calling them to something else. He's saying, listen, you can grumble and complain, but you're not going to be very attractive. You can grumble and complain, but it's only going to prove right what everybody's saying about the church in Philippi. It's only going to prove right. It's only going to feel like justification to the people who are pressing against you, that are persecuting you. Instead, don't grumble and complain. Then you can become blameless and pure. Now, still kind of thinking through the lens of Paul, Paul would rather have the Christians in the city of Philippi be persecuted and be blameless and pure. Like, there's no reason for the persecution. They may not like the church in Philippi, but at least they're blameless and pure in terms of their reputation, because that's what Paul really cares about. He says, listen, the grumbling and complaining is turning you inward, but the result of that is you have a bad reputation in the community. They already don't like you. Don't give them more reason not to not like you. In fact, I'd rather you become blameless and pure. Now, Paul isn't talking about being perfect. Paul isn't talking about a really strict and rigid morality. Paul is talking about how they are perceived in relationship with those who are outside of the church of Philippi. He's very much concerned with how others are viewing the church. That's what Paul is considering. That's the whole point of this letter that Paul writes. He has two focuses: to correct the internal struggles that are going on in the church and to remind them about their reputation in the community. Paul says if you can pay attention to how you're viewed in the community, if you can, as far as everybody else is concerned, be blameless and pure, it won't stop the persecution, but at least it'll be for the right reasons. At least it'll be because they're seeing you as you're meant to be. Then you will be like children of God. And then he calls this group around them, the world around them, he calls them a warped and crooked generation. Now that might seem really harsh. It might sound more like just the church being the church, Christians being judgy and Christian, but that's not exactly what's going on either. You see, I believe, and I don't know for sure, but I believe that the grumbling and complaining that is inward in the Philippian church has given language and justification to the people outside the church who are criticizing them. And I believe that grumbling and complaining, I believe that the issues that the church is focusing on, their persecution, is giving now language and ammunition for those who want to mistreat them. I think they were taking the words of the church and they were twisting them and they were warping them. I think they were taking the grumbling and complaining and they were twisting it and warping it and using it against the church. And Paul says, no, I want you to be pure and blameless. Then they won't have anything to twist and warp. In fact, you'll be kind of like a shiny star in the sky. I want you to be careful how you're perceived in the community. Because they might not still like you, but then they won't be able to twist and warp what you've said. I think there's a lot of Christians in the United States that over the last decades have called different things persecution. Now, I'm not denying that some level of persecution might exist in pockets of America, but most of what we call persecution in the church is because somebody doesn't agree with our preferences, not because somebody is opposed to our faith. I think it's because sometimes we elevate things that are less than crucial and take a stand and draw lines in places that I don't know if Jesus really cares that we draw a line. I think he cares about those things, but I don't think he would say that's where we draw the line. When we do that as Christians, when we do that as followers of Jesus, we give the world around us something to look at us and something to put in the headlines that is unnecessary. That's why Paul says, listen, if you can become blameless and pure, then you're going to shine among them, this crooked and warped generation. You're going to shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. As Paul continues on, he writes, and then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. Now, Paul has written a lot. If you read, Paul wrote a majority of what we call the New Testament. That's the newest writings in Scripture. It's everything. Paul wrote a majority of all the text in this book following the stories of Jesus. And Paul also wrote a lot about boasting. He said in his life he has a lot of reasons that he could boast, but he won't. But Paul was actually an incredibly humble person. But now here he talks about boasting again. He says, and then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ. Paul is talking when everything is wrapped up. Paul believes, and we believe, that Jesus will return again, and that's what Paul's talking about. He says when Jesus returns in that day of Christ, he's going to boast when he sees that the church of Philippi is living in this manner. When they shine like stars, when they hold fast to the good news about Jesus, then in the very end, Paul will finally be able to boast. He's going to boast because he didn't run or labor in vain. Now, here's where Paul starts to get a little bit confusing, I think. What's he talking about? Run or labor in vain. Now, I think a part of this is a bit of existential crisis that Paul has sitting in the midst of prison. We are familiar with existential crisis. Most of us, maybe you're like midlife crisis, like we get that. I'm looking forward to mine. I'm planning on capitalizing it. I'm going to have a good time. I'm even planning it out a little bit, right? I want to do it right. I don't want to look back on my midlife existential crisis and be like, I could have gotten a lot crazier, right? I want to like go all out for this midlife. Some of you, I think, probably wasted your midlife crisis. You had an opportunity and you wasted it. Paul is kind of having this existential crisis in the midst of prison. And he looks at it and he says, listen, these people that I've invested in over the years, I don't have freedom anymore. But these people over the years, they're starting to kind of fall apart. They're starting to freak out and panic. And I'm not sure they have the chops to see this thing out. I'm not sure they have the strength to carry on. I'm not sure they can actually pull this off. But if they do, I'm not proud of much in my own life, I think Paul would say, other than Jesus. His boast was always in Jesus, but he will boast in Jesus before Jesus himself if the church holds on. He wants to know that the time he had free, like did his work actually amount to anything? Was his work significant? If he were to die in prison the very next day, which is a very real possibility for Paul, he doesn't know. Justice wasn't just for them. He could have just gotten murdered on the way to trial by people who didn't like him. Paul didn't know if he would be alive the next day, and he starts looking at the work that he's done in investing different churches, and Paul helped start the church of Philippi. And he's looking at them and he's saying, did my work actually matter? Did I run or did I labor with them in vain? He wants to know that his effort is producing something. But he also realizes he might not know until the very end when they stand before Jesus and Jesus reveals what is and what has been. Paul wants to be proud of them in that day. Paul wants to know that his life wasn't insignificant. He doesn't want his tombstone to be about himself. He wants the fruit of where he's invested to be written on his tombstone. He wants to see the places that he's labored written on his tombstone. If somebody's going to say something about him after his death, he doesn't want it to be that he's so good or he knew so much about Jesus. He wants it to be he invested in the church of Philippi and they did well. That's the win for Paul. Now, that's a hard thing for us to grasp in our world. We don't even know it, but we've been born into a culture where, at least professionally, you work your way up the ladder. You work your way up this ladder of success, and you'll step on anybody who gets in the way. I've seen plenty of people who have had relationships with other people just for the sake of their own advancement. And once they get up to the next level, now they have a new group of friends, and they're going to invest in those people just enough to get ahead. And it's like relationships aren't relationships. They're just help to get you to where you need to go. It's support in our journey to accumulate things. We often, whether we are aware of it or not, all of us, Christian or non-Christian, have this very me-focused accumulation mindset. It's just built into us. We view the world through what we have. Do I have enough? If not, somebody else has it, and I can go get it. We've been born into this mindset that you can make anything you want out of yourself. There's a great mindset. There's nothing wrong with that, but there is a downside to it. It means we'll do whatever we have to do to make something out of ourselves. We'll do whatever we have to do to accumulate, to grasp hold of, to become who we need to be. But Paul looks at that. He could have had that. His life story before he followed Jesus was that he was at the top of his social ladder. He had social status. He had religious status. He was a leader in the church. And he said, actually, I consider all of that garbage in comparison with knowing Jesus. Paul doesn't want his accomplishments on his tombstone. He wants the accomplishments of Jesus through his followers. That's all he wants to know. That's what he wants to brag about. That's why he follows this up with verse 17. He says this, "But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you." Anybody pour out a drink offering today? Didn't think so. That's not something we do. It's not something that we're used to. But even in a lot of cultures today, but especially in the time that Paul is writing this, a lot of cultures were very used to sacrifice, the sacrificial system. Offerings and sacrifices were a regular practice. One of the very regular sacrifices was a drink offering where you would just pour it out. It could be a solo offering, or it might be poured on top of another offering that's being burnt or given up to a deity. And Paul looks at that imagery and he uses a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for his own life. And he says, listen, if I never get out of prison, if I die here, I'm just going to consider my life a drink offering that is poured out for you. Man, talk about the opposite direction of being self-centered, me-focused about what he can grasp. Paul didn't even really care if he got out of prison. That wasn't his primary objective. Paul's primary objective was to go back and check on those around him and say, hey, how are you doing? You doing all right? Are you still living out what you said you wanted to live out? Are you still being fruitful? Paul considered his life of no other value other than to be poured out on the sake of the church, and not just for the church, but for the reputation of the church. Again, one of Paul's main thrusts in this letter is to make sure that the church in Philippi, that the believers in Philippi are being experienced by those outside of the church as loving and pure and blameless. Paul is in prison for preaching the good news of Jesus, of telling them that God has shown his love through the person of Jesus. And Paul wants to reorient the church of Philippi to say, don't forget, you need to stop grumbling and complaining because you're missing the whole point. The people around you do not know the love of Jesus. You don't need to prove yourself as right. You don't need to prove yourself as powerful. You need to prove yourself as loving. And if I have to pour myself out like a drink offering, if I lose my life here, I'm okay with that. You just do what you're supposed to do. I will spend myself on your behalf. And then Paul continues with this offering metaphor. And he talks about the work of the church of Philippi, the believers, the followers of Jesus in Philippi, and he calls their lives a sacrifice. A sacrifice of what? A sacrifice of testifying to the love and the goodness of Jesus around them. They're in the midst of a group of people who would be very happy to twist their words for the purposes of their own religious persecution. And Paul reflects the attitude and words of Jesus, and he says, no, don't grumble and complain about that. Love them well. Give them a reason to talk about you in a different way. They're talking about you. What are they saying? Let it be about being pure and blameless, even if you have to spend yourself doing it, even if you have to pour yourself out entirely. It's not about you or your desires or your own safety. Spend yourself on behalf of others. That's Paul's message to the church. That's Paul's hope and desire. And he ends with rejoice. He says, if this is the way we end, if this is the way that my life ends, if I'm just pouring myself out on your sake and you're pouring yourself out for the sake of those around you, then let's rejoice about it, because that's the win. That's the true win. That's how the church wins. That's how it becomes shiny like stars in the sky, is they spend themselves on the sake of others. And we might in our mind think, no, wait a second. The justice system there is skewed. The justice system is off. They should be protecting those Christians. And Paul, in the midst of being in jail, in the midst of a broken justice system, says, no, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is whether they're just or not, you are. Whether they get justice or not, whether they mistreat you or not, it doesn't matter. You be just. You be the justice of God, which, again, I just want to remind you, we started talking about this last week. The justice of God is always restoration and love and mercy. It's not judgment, condemnation, and criticism. It's restoration, love, and mercy. That's what the justice heart of God is. And Paul calls the followers of Jesus in the city of Philippi back to that understanding. He says, listen, we might be poured out, but that's justice. That's the heart of God. That's what you should be after. Don't worry about the external things. Here's what I want us to grasp about the church and justice. That justice is about pouring yourself out for others. That's what it is. Justice, God's justice, I'm not talking about any other definition of justice that we might hold to. God's justice is about pouring ourselves out for the sake of others. And we started with, what does the neighborhood around us think about the Alliance Church on 36th Ave? They don't know us. We're irrelevant. I have this weird belief system. I think that if we believe what Jesus said is true about himself, it should change the world around us. I think that if we actually believe what Jesus said, that should change me, and that should cause me to be more loving to others. I think we've gotten a little bit off in the church. I think we've started kind of looking at ourselves, and it's like we kind of have this pity party over the last decade in church. And there's been a weird social dynamic. There's been a dynamic where our culture has shifted away from just assuming most of Christianity's value system. For generations, it just blindly accepted Christianity's value systems. It was built into everybody's understanding of how life worked. But that's changed in the last 10 to 20 years. And instead of looking at that as a way to just love others well, here's what I've seen growing up in the church in the last 2 decades. We've kind of thrown ourselves a little pity party. Well, why isn't anybody showing up? Why isn't anybody coming in the doors? Don't they know how good this is? Isn't that what they want? Well, let's just make it more entertaining because they're eventually going to come into church anyway. No, they are not. They don't care. Nobody outside this church cares about this church. They don't. They're not waiting for somebody to come along and be like, hey, did you know about the church on 36th Ave? What church? The white church? No, that's the LDS church. It's the gray church down the road. I didn't even know there was a church. Well, you should be there. It's really cool. Well, I don't really care. Oh, wasn't expecting that. You see, the goal can't be to get people in our door so that somehow they can see that we're right about the way they should live. If you're not a believer or if you got coerced into coming to church today, I'm gonna be blunt. I don't care how you live. You live how you want to live. You don't even have to accept the things that I'm saying. That's okay. We might believe 2 very different things, but here's what I do believe. That once you experience the love of Jesus, you will care how you live. It will make a difference in you. And so here's what I believe about our neighborhood. That if we can truly become a just church and we can learn to pour ourselves out on behalf of our neighbors, they might experience the love of Jesus. And they might look at this building as a symbol of hope, like kind of a shining beacon, and maybe they still don't agree with us, but they feel loved because of us. I would rather they mourn our passing than be indifferent or celebrate our passing. I would rather they be mad at us for the right reasons. These people won't leave me alone. They keep trying to be nice to me. You see, just like Paul, I believe that we are supposed to be like a drink offering that is poured out for the sake of other people. Not because it benefits us. This requires self-sacrifice. This requires sacrificial living. And that's what I believe we're called to. I believe that we're called to live self-sacrificially. I believe that we're called to address the issue of this me-centric living and be other-centric living. But that's a difficult thing to confront. Pastor and professor and scholar Walter Brueggemann writes this about the issue. We must confess that the central problem of our lives is that we are torn apart by the conflict between our attraction to the good news of God's abundance and the power of our belief in scarcity, a belief that makes us greedy, mean, and catch this, unneighborly. We spend our lives trying to sort out that ambiguity. Friends, I think if Paul was writing to us, he would probably write the same words that he wrote to the church of Philippi. And right now I'm just talking to Christians. If you call this church your home and you're a regular here, I think Paul would write this to us. And I'm including myself. I'm not trying to condemn you. I'm throwing myself in there as well. I think Paul would write this to us, and he would say, hey, you guys are concerned about a lot of things, and they're not even bad things. But you're in the midst of a community that isn't seeing what you see. And they don't see you as a shiny star in the sky. They see you as somebody who's accumulating. They see you as somebody who's noisy in their backyard. They see you as somebody who increases the traffic and makes life inconvenient. They see you as somebody who throws loud parties in the backyard that seems like maybe they're not even welcome. And maybe we think, well, that's not what we think. But we live in a culture of accumulation. And when we do things like that, it looks like we're internally focused, and Paul would call us to be externally focused. Paul would say, listen, you have to spend yourself on others. You can't accumulate. You can't want something from people. You have to want something for people. And when you want something for people, you will spend your life on them. You will be willing to take up God's justice, and you will be willing to pour yourself out for others. And I believe we can do this best collectively. There's an individual reality to this, for sure, but there's a collective reality that's even better. And I want to give you a few ways that we can act collectively to make this a reality, to be like that shining star, to be a church that pours ourselves out for the sake of others. And the first one I'm going to say is give generously. Now, if you don't know me and you don't know my heart, you're probably thinking, okay, money is the first thing the pastor mentions. Very likely. If you know me, you'll know I hate talking about money. Why are we talking about money? Paul didn't mention money. No, but Paul mentioned an attitude of generosity. Paul talked about generosity. That's what it means to pour yourself out, is to live overly generous without a need, without being prompted, without being asked or coerced, but to give of ourselves generously, of our time, of our resources, of the things we can do, of all of that. Paul is saying, listen, you need to give generously, to pour yourselves out on behalf of others. You have to pour yourselves out in all that you have. You have to give generously. And again, what I'm not asking is, I'm not actually asking for your money. I am talking about stuff that includes money, but I'm not asking for your money because I don't want your money. But here's what I do believe. I believe that if we pool all of our resources, including our finances, together, we can do something amazing. I believe that we'll have the opportunity to truly be a blessing in our neighborhood if we can learn to give generously. And what we want for this whole church is not just to give individually in generosity. We want to give as a church in generosity. We have some initiatives that we're going to be sharing with you over the next couple weeks. And we're going to be sharing things that we want to see happen, that we believe will be a source of justice in our neighborhood. And I'm not talking about the whole of Yakima at this point. I'm talking about this zip code. I'm talking about this neighborhood. I'm talking about the place that our church is in this space and in this time. We have some initiatives that we're going to be talking about, and they're going to require finances. They're going to require people to step up and to take part in it. And it's going to require people to pour themselves out, all of us collectively, to pour ourselves out on behalf of the neighborhood. But I think if we do this, we're going to be known as a generous church. Isn't that worthwhile? Like, would you rather be known as a stingy church or a generous church? Well, it's an easy one. Everybody wants to be seen as generous, but that means we all have to be generous. We all have to be generous. I have to be generous. My family has to be sacrificially generous. That's what I'm inviting you to. Be sacrificially generous. Because the goal isn't that we have a padded bank account. The goal is that we have the resources we need to do what we believe God is asking us to do to bless our neighborhood. Right? That understanding of scarcity, that understanding of accumulation, as Brueggemann pointed out, that makes us unneighborly and mean. Let's be kind, loving, and generous. I think another way that we can do this that I'd invite you to is to dream with us. Now, many of you don't live in this neighborhood, okay? Actually, probably most of you don't live in this direct neighborhood. Maybe you're not even in this school district. That's okay. I want to ask you to think about the school district that we're in. Think about the neighborhood that we're in. And I want to invite you to dream with us. And here's the kind of dreams that I'm talking about. I got to serve at a church for a while, and I was in the missions department for local and international. And one of the missions, one of the initiatives that we had going on, that was actually now over 15 years, it grew to the point where it was now separate. It was its own 501c3, but it was called 70 times 7. And their understanding was that they took seriously the words of Jesus when he was talking to one of his followers, whose name was Peter. And Peter looked at Jesus, and he was trying to be really extreme and kind of win a few brownie points from Jesus. He was like, hey, Jesus, how many times should we forgive somebody who wrongs us? Like 7 times? And Jesus is like, no, like 70 times 7. You keep going. As many times as that person needs mercy and compassion and forgiveness, give it to them, even if it's 70 times 7. And so what this group of people decided to do is they were looking at their neighborhood, they were looking at their town, and they were noticing that there was an incredible amount of people who were coming out of incarceration and landing in their community, but they couldn't find jobs. Now, I believe, and I don't know personally, but I believe that the climate of that has shifted over the last 15 to 20 years, and it's gotten incrementally better, maybe not phenomenal, but a little bit better. But at the time, it was virtually impossible in that area to get a job coming out of incarceration. With a record from prison, you couldn't find work. And they said, that's not right. That is not right. We are going to spend ourselves, we're going to give generously on behalf of those people, and we're going to leverage our resources, we're going to leverage our relational connections, we're going to leverage our own Christian-owned businesses on their sake. And they created spaces within their church and within the businesses that were attached to the church so that people coming out of incarceration could find work. And it still goes on to this day, and it's grown so much that they're starting to learn how to be justice-oriented in caring for the families of people who are incarcerated because they have a great loss as well. You see, God's desire isn't that people suffer. God's desire is that people flourish under his love and reflect his mercy. And 70 times 7 was doing that. That was a dream that they had of how they could pour themselves out for the sake of others. There's another one that comes from Salem, Oregon, another Alliance church in Salem Alliance Church. And it's called the Royal Order of the Red Suspenders. Fancy, huh? The idea is that if you serve with them for a full year, you get your own set of red suspenders. But here's what they do. They noticed one day that there was a group of people sitting around, and they were like, listen, we don't have speaking gifts. We're not good at a whole lot, but we know how to split wood. And that's what we do. We could do that all day long. We've got weekends. Some of us are retired. Like, we can split wood. And we know there's people in rural areas that heat with wood. And when it gets cold, There's families and individuals that can't gather their own firewood for various reasons. Maybe they don't have the time, maybe they don't have the physical capability, but that's how they heat their house. So what we can do is we can spend ourselves and we can go cut and split wood and deliver it to people who need it. It's a small piece of justice. And so what I'm inviting you to do is not to go out and split wood or to leverage your business or your relational connections on behalf of people who are incarcerated, but maybe what I'm asking you to do is dream about the needs in this community, the actual needs in this community, and start dreaming like, what could we do that reflects the justice and mercy of God? What can we do that steps into the restoration and the blessing of our immediate neighborhood in this place and in this time? Now, to be sure, I want you to bless your neighbors where you live as well. But more than that, I want us to understand how beautiful our collaboration together can be in this neighborhood if we pay attention. We've got some cool things coming up that we want to share with you, but there should never be an end to the dreaming that we get to do together, because God is always a God of blessing. And maybe, just maybe, God's going to use the dream you have to bless the neighborhood, a neighborhood in this community. And I want to be very clear, it doesn't matter how young you are. Kids that are still in here, young adults that are still in here, your finger on the pulse of our world is crucial for us to know. Like already, my generation is losing touch with the needs of this world, and we need you. And we need your ideas, we need your dreams, and we want to empower them. People who are on the opposite end of young. I'm working on my diplomacy. People who are on the opposite end of young, you're not irrelevant. And I want to speak very bluntly, I know some of you have even told me, I'm not sure where I fit anymore. Here's where I'm asking you to fit. Don't dream about what we used to do, dream about what we could do. The goal is still blessing and loving others, but we got to start making some tweaks to how we do that. Dream with us. Help us identify the needs of this neighborhood and help us become a blessing. And then finally, I want to ask you to pray for our neighbors. Now, just a quick note, like, if you're not sure where you are with Jesus, you could still do those other two things at some level, and you're still going to benefit massively. Like, those are still good things to do. Prayer is we're talking about prayer to Jesus, and so that might be a little bit different for you, but I'd still encourage you to give it a try. But for those who are followers of Jesus, I want to ask you to pray for our neighbors. Now, I'm not just talking about your neighbors, but I want that too. Like, we talk a lot about that. I'm asking you to pray for our neighbors. Maybe we could commit to walking the streets of our neighborhood and praying blessing. Like, pour yourself out in time and in prayer for the sake of our neighbors. You could pray that God would give them breakthrough in their finances, that God would heal marriages, that God would restore parenting-child relationships, that God would bring provision. Maybe you could pray for the church that we would have eyes to see what God wants us to do and give us inlets to be able to bless people, not to get something from them, but because we want something for them. Because we're looking for chances to pour ourselves out. That's what we want. And the only return we really want is that in the end, when we stand before Jesus, we can say, hey, look at that. We didn't labor in vain. We did what God was asking us to do. Now, I don't care if somebody in our neighborhood sets foot in this church. I hope they do. But I don't care if it doesn't happen. What I do care is that we're irrelevant to them. We don't need to be on a bullhorn. We don't need to be on a loudspeaker with our message. That's not the problem. The problem is we need to learn how to pour ourselves out in generosity, in dreaming, and in prayer for the sake of our neighborhood. I think if we can do that, we're going to be known as this kind of shiny church, and not because the paint on our roof is fading, okay? But because we poured ourselves out for the sake of others. I think that if we were to close our doors in 5 years, I think if we did that, our neighbors would actually grieve. They might even say, listen, I didn't agree with them, but I'm sad they're gone. They were really good to us. The best neighbors on the block. They're the most generous people. That's what I would hope for. I believe that we could take that heart of justice and chase after it. And I'm inviting us to do that on whatever level you can. Let's pray.